I was still standing in black when my mother-in-law said it, still moving through the house like a ghost that didn't know it had died yet. The living room was crowded with flowers that smelled too sweet, sympathy cards stacked neatly on the side table like obligations I hadn't found the strength to open. My husband had been gone for less than a week, and every sound still startled me: doors closing, phones buzzing, footsteps that weren't his. We were all gathered there after the funeral, family sitting where family always sat, except nothing felt familiar anymore. That was when she cleared her throat, smiled tightly, and said, "This is our son's house now. You can visit on weekends." What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything, but first, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comment section. For a moment, I genuinely thought grief had finally broken something in my brain. The words didn't register as language at first, they floated in the air like smoke, shapeless and unreal. I remember looking around the room, half expecting someone to laugh awkwardly or correct her, to remind her that I was standing right there, that I was his wife. No one did. My father-in-law stared at his hands. My sister-in-law avoided my eyes. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, and I realized with a slow, sinking certainty that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a decision that had already been discussed, just not with me. I tried to speak, but my mouth felt dry, like I'd swallowed dust. This house wasn't just a structure with walls and a roof, it was the place where my husband and I had planned our future in quiet moments after work, where we'd argued and forgiven each other, where I'd memorized the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. We had chosen the paint colors together. We had signed papers together. We had lived here together. And now, somehow, I was being reduced to a visitor, someone who needed permission to return to her own life on a schedule that suited them. My mother-in-law continued talking, her voice calm, almost gentle, as if she were explaining logistics instead of erasing me. She said it made sense. She said family property should stay in the family. She said I was still young and would move on, that I didn't need such a big place anymore. Each sentence landed like a small, precise cut, and I stood there nodding faintly, not because I agreed, but because shock had taken over my body and was operating it on autopilot. I noticed how composed she looked, how prepared, and it dawned on me that she had been waiting for this moment. Grief does strange things to time. That afternoon felt both endless and over in a blink. I remember sitting on the edge of the couch, hands folded in my lap, listening to them talk around me as if I were already gone. They discussed practicalities, who would stay in which room, how often they would visit, what changes they might make. Not once did anyone ask me what I wanted or needed. I wondered if this was how they had always seen me, temporary, replaceable, an accessory to their son rather than a part of their family. What hurt most wasn't just the cruelty of it. It was the casualness. There was no anger in her tone, no malice. Just entitlement. As if marriage had been a lease that expired with his death, as if love and years and shared history dissolved the moment he stopped breathing. I felt something inside me shrink, not because I believed her, but because I realized how alone I truly was in that room. Grief had stripped away any illusion of protection I thought being his wife afforded me. I excused myself eventually, mumbling something about needing air, and locked myself in the bathroom. I stared at my reflection for a long time, barely recognizing the woman looking back. My eyes were swollen, my face pale, my shoulders slumped under the weight of loss and disbelief. I pressed my hands against the sink and tried to breathe, tried to ground myself in something solid. This was my home. I told myself that silently, like a mantra. This was my life. But the words felt fragile, like they might shatter if spoken too loudly. When I returned to the living room, the conversation shifted abruptly, polite smiles snapping back into place. My mother-in-law patted my arm and told me to rest, told me I'd been through so much. The irony of her concern almost made me laugh. Instead, I nodded again, the habit of compliance hard to break, and retreated to the bedroom I shared with my husband, closing the door softly behind me. I sat on the bed we had shared and felt the weight of the day finally crash over me, heavy and suffocating. That night, as the house grew quiet and everyone settled into rooms they had already mentally claimed, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying her words over and over. "You can visit on weekends." The audacity of it began to cut through the numbness, sharp and undeniable. I realized then that my husband's death hadn't just taken the person I loved most. It had revealed exactly how little space I was allowed to occupy once he was gone. And something deep inside me, buried beneath shock and sorrow, began to stir. That was the moment I understood his death hadn't just ended a marriage, it had exposed everyone who'd been waiting for me to lose my place. The days after the funeral blurred together in a way that made time feel unreliable, like it could stretch or collapse without warning. I moved through the house quietly, instinctively, careful not to disturb anyone, even though this had been my home long before it became a shared space filled with whispers and watchful eyes. Every room carried echoes of my husband, his shoes still by the door, his coffee mug untouched in the sink, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the hallway. I existed in a constant state of ache, my grief raw and unfiltered, but it quickly became clear that my mourning had boundaries, invisible lines I wasn't supposed to cross. My mother-in-law took charge with unsettling ease. She organized meals, coordinated visitors, and spoke in that soft, authoritative tone that left no room for disagreement. She kept saying she was helping, and on the surface, it looked like she was. She cooked, cleaned, and fielded phone calls, but every act of kindness came with an unspoken condition: compliance. I noticed how she subtly rearranged things, moving items, claiming drawers, making herself comfortable in ways that suggested permanence. Each small change felt like a reminder that my presence here was being tolerated, not respected. People came and went, offering condolences that sounded rehearsed, their eyes flicking past me to my in-laws as if they were the true pillars of loss. I stood there accepting hugs, murmuring thanks, feeling like a secondary character in my own tragedy. When I cried too openly, I was met with concerned looks that seemed to say I was making things uncomfortable. When I withdrew, I was gently encouraged to be strong and focus on the future. There was no space to grieve authentically. Only ways that fit neatly into their expectations. One afternoon, while I was sitting alone in the kitchen staring at nothing, my sister-in-law joined me. She spoke softly, carefully, as if any wrong word might break something. She told me her mother meant well, that she was just trying to keep the family together. I nodded, because that was easier than saying what I really thought: that family apparently didn't include me anymore. The conversation left me feeling hollow, like I'd been reminded of my place without anyone needing to say it outright. A few days later, my friend Clara stopped by. She wasn't family, which meant she didn't tiptoe around the truth. She looked at me, really looked at me, and asked why I was letting them treat me like a guest. The question startled me, not because it was unfair, but because it cut straight through the fog I'd been living in. I opened my mouth to defend them, to explain grief and misunderstandings and timing, but the words felt thin even as I spoke them. Clara listened quietly, then told me something that stayed with me long after she left: shock can make you agreeable in ways you'd never choose consciously. That night, lying in bed alone, I replayed everything that had happened since my husband's death. The comments. The assumptions. The way decisions were made around me, not with me. I realized how exhaustion had dulled my instincts, how grief had made me quiet, compliant, almost invisible. It wasn't that I didn't feel anger or fear, it was that I didn't yet feel capable of acting on them. Mourning had become a kind of paralysis, and they were taking advantage of it whether they admitted it or not. I began to notice patterns I couldn't unsee. How my mother-in-law corrected me when I referred to the house as ours. How she spoke about keeping things in the family while looking past me. How my father-in-law deferred to her entirely, avoiding conflict by avoiding eye contact. Even meals felt orchestrated, with seating arrangements that subtly pushed me to the edge. None of it was overt enough to confront easily, which made it all the more insidious. Grief, I learned, wasn't just about losing my husband. It was about losing my sense of footing, my certainty about where I belonged. I had entered this marriage believing love created permanence, that commitment built a foundation no one else could dismantle. Watching that belief erode day by day was almost as painful as the loss itself. I felt foolish for not anticipating this, for not protecting myself sooner, but grief doesn't come with foresight, only hindsight. One evening, as I stood in the doorway of the living room watching my in-laws discuss future plans as if I weren't there, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost subtle. A realization settled in. They believed this chapter of my life was temporary, something to manage until I moved on. They assumed I would eventually leave quietly, grateful for their generosity. That assumption, more than anything else, woke something inside me. Grief had made me still, yes, but it hadn't erased me. I went to bed that night with a strange mix of sorrow and resolve. I didn't yet know what I would do or how I would do it. I only knew that this version of my life, one where my loss was used to shrink me, couldn't be the ending. My husband had loved me fiercely, intentionally. He hadn't built a life with me for it to be dismantled the moment he was gone. Remembering that didn't erase the pain, but it gave it shape, direction. As I lay there listening to the house settle around me, I realized something important. They mistook my silence for surrender. They thought grief had made me pliable, easy to manage. What they didn't understand was that grief had stripped everything unnecessary away. Beneath it, my instincts were still there, waiting. And when they finally surfaced, they would be impossible to ignore. What they didn't realize was that grief had made me quiet, not powerless. I found the folder by accident, which was fitting, because everything important in my life seemed to surface only when I stopped looking for it. It was tucked into the back of the small filing cabinet in my husband's study, the one I hadn't opened since before he got sick. I'd gone in there that morning with the simple intention of sorting through old bills, trying to feel useful in a house where usefulness was the only currency that still seemed to buy me space. The room smelled faintly of dust and paper, familiar and comforting in a way that made my chest ache. His chair was still pulled out, like he might come back and sit in it any moment. At first, I moved slowly, carefully, touching things like they might shatter if I handled them wrong. Old receipts. Instruction manuals. Notes he'd scribbled to himself in the margins of documents, reminders to follow up, to call someone, to fix something around the house. Each page felt like a conversation interrupted. I kept telling myself I would stop soon, that this was too much, but something kept pulling me deeper, like there was a reason I'd been drawn into that room that day. The folder itself was unremarkable, plain, slightly worn, labeled in his neat handwriting with a word so generic it almost felt intentional: estate. My heart thudded hard against my ribs when I picked it up. I hesitated, suddenly aware that this might be crossing an invisible line. It felt like opening a door I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through. But another thought followed quickly, sharp and grounding: I was his wife. If not me, then who had the right to know what was inside? I sat down at the desk and opened it. The first few pages were expected: insurance documents, account summaries, things I vaguely remembered us discussing in calmer times. Then I reached the paperwork I hadn't known existed, the pages that made my breath hitch as I read them over and over, struggling to reconcile what I was seeing with what I'd been told. Ownership details. Legal language. Clauses written in precise, unambiguous terms. I felt the fog in my head begin to thin, replaced by something cold and startlingly clear. The house my mother-in-law had so confidently declared belonged to their son's family line, was in my name. Not partially. Not conditionally. Entirely. My husband had transferred ownership years earlier, quietly, deliberately, long before illness ever entered the picture. There were notes attached, explanations in his handwriting that made my hands tremble as I read them. He'd written about wanting to make sure I was protected, about understanding his parents' tendency to overstep, about not wanting me to ever feel displaced or dependent. I sat there for a long time, the room spinning slightly as memory after memory rearranged itself in my mind. Casual comments he'd made about taking care of paperwork. The way he'd insisted on reviewing certain documents himself. The quiet seriousness in his voice when he talked about the future, about me being safe no matter what happened. I had thought it was just him being practical. I hadn't understood how much he had seen coming, or how much he had been shielding me from. What followed wasn't immediate relief. It was anger. Hot, sudden, and overwhelming. Anger at my in-laws for assuming ignorance. Anger at myself for doubting my place so easily. Anger that they had spoken to me the way they did, confident I had no ground to stand on. I realized then that their certainty hadn't come from truth, it had come from assumption. They had believed I wouldn't know. They had believed I wouldn't question. They had believed grief would keep me docile. I closed the folder and pressed my palms flat against the desk, breathing through the rush of emotion threatening to spill over. Part of me wanted to march straight into the living room and confront them, to end the charade immediately. Another part of me, quieter but firmer, told me to wait. To observe. To understand exactly how far they intended to go. This wasn't just about correcting a misunderstanding. It was about seeing the full shape of their intentions, now that I finally had clarity. That afternoon, I moved through the house differently. Straighter. Quieter. Listening more than speaking. I noticed how my mother-in-law referred to future plans with increasing confidence, how she spoke about renovations and rearranging without once including me. I noticed how my sister-in-law nodded along, how my father-in-law avoided the conversation altogether. They were already behaving like owners, like decision-makers, secure in the belief that the ground beneath them was solid. I wondered if my husband had known this would happen exactly as it was happening now. If he'd anticipated the speed with which grief would be weaponized, the ease with which I'd be sidelined. The thought made my chest tighten, not with sadness, but with a strange gratitude. He had trusted me enough to leave the truth where I could find it. He had believed I would be strong enough to use it when the time came. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the folder tucked safely away where no one else could stumble upon it. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because my understanding had. I replayed my mother-in-law's words in my mind, the calm authority with which she'd dismissed me. You can visit on weekends. The memory no longer made me feel small. It made me focused. I didn't sleep much. My thoughts kept circling the same question. What did honoring my husband really mean? Was it staying quiet to keep the peace, letting his parents rewrite our life together because it was easier? Or was it standing my ground, refusing to let his love for me be erased by convenience and entitlement? The answer, once it formed, felt undeniable. Honoring him meant honoring what we had built together, including the boundaries he'd already put in place for me. By morning, the shock had fully transformed into resolve. I wasn't eager for confrontation. I wasn't craving vindication. What I wanted was balance restored, truth acknowledged. I knew now that I wasn't fighting from a place of desperation or uncertainty. I was standing on solid ground, even if no one else realized it yet. And that knowledge changed everything. As I got out of bed and prepared to face another day in a house full of people who believed I was temporary, I felt something new settle into my bones. It wasn't confidence exactly. It was steadiness. The kind that comes from knowing you're not wrong, not lost, not powerless. They thought I was grieving blindly, stumbling forward without direction. They had no idea I was already standing at the edge of a revelation they weren't prepared for. For the first time since he died, I felt something other than loss, I felt clarity. By the time the weekend arrived, the house no longer felt like a place of mourning, it felt like a stage. Every room had been subtly rearranged, not enough to draw immediate protest, but just enough to signal ownership. Throw pillows I hadn't chosen. A framed photo moved from the hallway to the mantel. Even the kitchen cabinets had been reorganized, my habits quietly overwritten by someone else's preferences. I noticed all of it, catalogued every change, but said nothing. Silence, I'd learned, made people careless. And careless people revealed themselves. My mother-in-law announced the family gathering over breakfast as if it were a favor she was doing me. She said it would be good for everyone, that I shouldn't be alone, that family needed to stick together during difficult times. I nodded, stirring my coffee long after the sugar had dissolved, listening to her speak about the house like it was already hers to host in. She referred to it as our place twice, and each time, I felt the words land differently than before. Not as a wound, but as a test she didn't know she was administering. People began arriving late morning. Aunts. Cousins. Family friends I barely knew but had seen enough times to recognize the pattern in their sympathy. They hugged me, told me how strong I was, then drifted past me toward my in-laws like gravity pulled them there. Conversations clustered around my mother-in-law, her voice steady and authoritative as she accepted condolences with the practiced ease of someone who had already decided how the story would be told. I stood near the edge of it all, watching, listening, learning. It didn't take long for the comments to start. Subtle at first. Someone remarked on how nice it was that I'd be able to visit and still feel connected. Another suggested it might be good for me to have space, to start fresh somewhere new. Each comment was delivered with a smile, wrapped in concern, but underneath it was the same assumption: I was already gone. I responded politely, carefully, never correcting them. Letting them believe what they wanted to believe felt oddly empowering. The moment that shifted everything came from an unexpected place. I was standing near the kitchen doorway when one of my husband's cousins leaned in, lowering her voice conspiratorially. She asked me, almost casually, if I'd started packing yet. When I looked at her, confused, she hesitated, then added, "Oh, I just assumed, since they were talking about converting the guest room into a nursery." The words hit me harder than anything else had so far. Not because I was surprised, but because this was confirmation. I asked her what she meant, keeping my voice even. She looked uncomfortable, glancing toward the living room where my mother-in-law was laughing with a group of relatives. "I probably shouldn't have said anything," she murmured. "They were just talking about the future. About how this place would be perfect for, well, the next chapter." She trailed off, clearly realizing she'd said too much. I thanked her calmly and stepped away before she could apologize herself into silence. That was the moment I understood how far this had gone. They weren't just waiting for me to leave. They were planning for after. Rearranging rooms. Reimagining the house. Erasing me from the physical space as thoroughly as they had already erased me from the family narrative. Standing there, surrounded by people who believed I was already a footnote, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. This wasn't confusion anymore. It was intention. I moved through the rest of the afternoon like an observer, detached but alert. I noticed how my mother-in-law gave impromptu tours of the house, explaining potential changes, speaking in hypotheticals that were anything but hypothetical. I noticed how no one corrected her. How my father-in-law nodded along, how my sister-in-law smiled tightly, avoiding my gaze. It was clear now, they had all agreed, silently or explicitly, that I was temporary. That my grief had an expiration date they'd already marked on a calendar. At one point, my mother-in-law pulled me aside, her hand resting possessively on my arm. She told me she hoped I wasn't overwhelmed, that everyone just wanted to make sure things stayed stable. She spoke slowly, kindly, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. I listened, then asked her, just once, what she meant by stability. She hesitated for the briefest second before answering. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. As the gathering wound down, people began saying their goodbyes, thanking my in-laws for hosting. Hosting. The word echoed in my mind as I watched them leave, one by one, their assumptions intact. When the house finally quieted again, I stood alone in the living room, surrounded by furniture that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The sun dipped low through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. I thought about the folder hidden safely away, about the truth sitting patiently where no one else thought to look. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I sat at the kitchen table and made a list, not of what I'd lost, but of what I needed to do. Practical things. Deliberate steps. I wasn't preparing for battle. I was preparing to reclaim what was already mine. The difference mattered. This wasn't about proving them wrong in public. It was about ending the quiet disrespect they thought I wouldn't notice. Before going to bed, I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the banister, the door frames. Each contact grounded me, reminded me that this space held my life, my memories, my marriage. No one else's assumptions could change that. I paused in the doorway of the study, looking at the desk where I'd found the folder, and felt a strange sense of gratitude. Not just for the legal protection, but for the clarity my husband had left me when he knew I might need it most. They thought the weekend had gone exactly as planned. They believed I was still floating in grief, still unsure, still waiting to be told what came next. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I realized how deeply mistaken they were. They had revealed their hand completely, confident I had none of my own. And soon, very soon, they were going to learn just how wrong that assumption was. They were already dividing what they thought I no longer owned. I realized something was wrong the moment I pulled into the driveway and saw the unfamiliar car parked where my husband always used to leave his. The house looked the same from the outside, quiet, orderly, deceptively normal, but there was a tension in the air I couldn't explain until I stepped out of my car and tried the front door. The key didn't turn. I tried again, slower this time, as if patience alone might convince the lock to recognize me. It didn't. My hand tightened around the key, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears, and I felt that familiar surge of disbelief, the kind that comes right before anger has time to form. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the door like it might open out of guilt. When it didn't, I knocked, hard enough that the sound echoed through the house. Footsteps followed, then the door swung open to reveal my mother-in-law, her expression flickering briefly through surprise before settling into something composed and almost smug. She didn't invite me in. She didn't step aside. She simply looked at me and said, "We thought it would be easier this way." That was it. No warning. No conversation. Just a decision made in my absence. She explained, calmly and confidently, that they'd changed the locks for security, that it was better if I coordinated visits ahead of time, that emotions were still high and boundaries were important. The irony of her invoking boundaries nearly took my breath away. I asked her who had authorized the change, and she hesitated just long enough to tell me she knew she'd overplayed her hand. Before she could answer, my sister-in-law appeared behind her, arms crossed, eyes hard with the kind of righteousness that comes from believing you're on the morally superior side of a story. The conversation escalated quickly, voices rising, words tumbling over each other in a messy collision of entitlement and justification. They told me I was being unreasonable. That I was emotional. That this was temporary. I listened quietly, my hands shaking not from fear, but from restraint. Every instinct screamed at me to pull the folder from my bag and end this immediately. But I didn't. Not yet. There was something important in letting them say everything they believed out loud, in watching them expose just how far they thought they could go. Neighbors had started to notice by then, drawn by the noise, the spectacle of a woman standing locked out of her own home while her in-laws argued in the doorway. That public element emboldened them. My mother-in-law raised her voice, declaring that the house belonged to her son's family, that I was being disrespectful by making a scene. Hearing her say it again, so loudly, so confidently, was almost surreal. It was the same sentence she'd used to erase me days earlier, now weaponized for an audience. I felt something settle inside me then, heavy and unmistakable. Not anger. Not sadness. Certainty. I reached into my bag slowly, deliberately, and pulled out my phone, not the folder. I called my attorney instead. I didn't look at them while I spoke. I didn't need to. My voice was calm, steady, painfully clear as I explained the situation. Illegal lockout. Ownership dispute. Immediate intervention. When I hung up, the silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't dismissive anymore. It was uneasy. My mother-in-law asked who I'd called. I told her. The color drained from her face in stages, disbelief giving way to irritation, then something closer to panic. She told me I was overreacting, that lawyers weren't necessary, that family matters should stay within the family. That was when I finally looked at her and said the words I'd been holding back for weeks: "You stopped treating me like family the moment you decided I didn't belong here." The truth of it landed hard, stripping away whatever justification she'd been clinging to. When the locksmith arrived, called by them, trying to regain control of the situation, the scene tipped fully into chaos. Conflicting instructions. Raised voices. My sister-in-law insisting I had no right to be there. The locksmith, understandably confused, asked for proof of ownership. I handed him a copy of the documents I'd made sure to bring with me that day. Watching his expression change as he read them was quietly validating. Watching theirs change was something else entirely. The shift was immediate and brutal. Accusations flew. My mother-in-law demanded to know how long I'd known. My sister-in-law accused me of manipulation. My father-in-law finally spoke, his voice strained, asking why I hadn't said anything sooner. I answered honestly, because I needed to know who they were before I decided how to respond. That answer didn't sit well with them. It wasn't meant to. Truth rarely does when it dismantles a carefully constructed narrative. By the time it was over, the locksmith had restored my access, the neighbors had dispersed, and my in-laws stood in the driveway looking smaller than I'd ever seen them. They tried to soften then. Apologies surfaced, clumsy and inconsistent. My mother-in-law said she was only trying to protect her family. I nodded, because I finally understood what she meant by that, and how little it included me. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told them this conversation wasn't finished, but it would continue on my terms. As I closed the door behind me and stood alone in the quiet house, I felt the full weight of what had just happened settle over me. They had crossed a line they couldn't uncross, and in doing so, they had given me exactly what I needed: certainty without doubt. I wasn't fighting shadows or misunderstandings anymore. I was responding to deliberate actions taken with confidence and entitlement. Whatever came next would be final, not because I wanted revenge, but because I was done explaining my right to exist in my own life. They thought the house was theirs. They didn't know I was about to prove otherwise. The house felt different once the door closed behind me, not because anything had changed physically, but because I had. The silence no longer felt accusatory or heavy with judgment. It felt earned. I stood in the entryway for a long time, key still in my hand, listening to the quiet settle into corners that had recently been filled with other people's certainty. For weeks, I had moved through this space like I was borrowing it, like my presence needed justification. Now, standing there alone, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge the truth without flinching: this was my home, and it always had been. Grief had blurred that reality, but it hadn't erased it. I spent the next few days doing things deliberately, almost ceremonially. I changed the locks again, this time properly, legally, unquestionably. I notified my attorney to proceed with formal notices, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Boundaries only work when they're enforced, and I had learned the hard way that vague kindness was easily mistaken for permission. Every document I signed, every call I made, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had surrendered too easily in the past. I wasn't angry while I did it. I was calm. Calm enough to know this wasn't about winning, it was about ending something that had gone on far too long. When my mother-in-law called, I let it go to voicemail. When she texted, the messages shifted quickly from indignation to pleading, from certainty to fear. She talked about family, about tradition, about how my husband would have wanted us to stay close. Reading those words, I felt a deep, aching sadness, not because I doubted myself, but because I knew how wrong she was. My husband had wanted me safe. He had wanted me secure. He had wanted me respected. That was why he'd done what he'd done quietly, thoughtfully, without fanfare. He had left me a boundary, not a weapon. I responded once, carefully. I told her the house was not open for visits, scheduled or otherwise. I told her any further communication would go through legal channels. I didn't justify myself. I didn't explain my feelings. I stated facts and let them stand on their own. Sending that message felt heavier than any confrontation we'd had in person, because it closed the door on the illusion that we could return to what had been. There was no going back to a version of our relationship that depended on my silence. My sister-in-law reached out next, her message longer, more emotional. She accused me of tearing the family apart, of using my husband's death to assert control. I read it twice before replying. When I did, I told her something I hadn't said out loud before: families don't fall apart because someone finally enforces boundaries, they fall apart because those boundaries were needed in the first place. I told her I wished her well. I meant it. Wishing someone well doesn't require sacrificing yourself to keep them comfortable. The hardest message to read was the one that never came, from my husband. I found myself thinking about what he would say if he could see all of this unfolding. I imagined him sitting at the kitchen table, listening quietly, the way he always did before offering an opinion that cut straight through the noise. I didn't imagine him angry. I imagined him relieved. Relieved that I'd stopped doubting myself. Relieved that the protection he'd put in place hadn't been wasted on someone too afraid to use it. I packed up the things my in-laws had brought with them and left them neatly by the front door for pickup, arranged through my attorney. I didn't touch anything else. I didn't erase them from the house out of spite. I simply restored it to what it had been before grief turned it into contested ground. When the house was finally mine again in every sense, I walked through it slowly, room by room, letting memories surface without being hijacked by pain. The laughter, the arguments, the ordinary moments, they all belonged to me too. No one could take that away. That evening, I sat on the back steps as the sun dipped low, the sky streaked with colors my husband used to stop and admire. I felt the grief then, fully and honestly, without interruption. It hurt. It always would. But it no longer came tangled with fear or displacement. I wasn't grieving and fighting for survival at the same time anymore. I was just grieving. And there was a strange, quiet peace in that distinction. I had protected the life we built, not by clinging to it, but by refusing to let it be rewritten without me. I understood then that standing up for myself hadn't erased my loss, it had given it dignity. I hadn't dishonored my husband by saying no to his family. I had honored him by believing him when he said, in actions rather than words, that I mattered. The door I closed wasn't slammed. It was shut firmly, intentionally, with both hands steady. And on the other side of it, for the first time since his death, I could finally breathe. If you've ever been made to feel like your place in someone's life was conditional, especially during your most vulnerable moments, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments. Sometimes reclaiming your space is the bravest form of love there is. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real stories about grief, boundaries, and choosing yourself when it matters most.